All right, everyone. The Huffington Post is very worried that fascism is creeping into Nicaragua. You see, their wonderful socialist government, provably democratic socialists, an elected body and so forth, was just fine. And then Ortega decided that instead of ignoring dissidents, he would shoot them. Now all of a sudden he's a fascist. Yeah, he's no longer a socialist. His economic policies, they're the same. His diplomatic policies, they're the same. Domestic policies, 99% the same. All of a sudden, though, it's no longer real socialism. It's just fascism. And they're doing this preemptively. It's like with Venezuela. Salon for years, and other groups, the HuffPo, MSNBC, CNN, like, oh, we should take their economic model and import it here. We should be doing what they do because look at how they're growing quickly. Their quality of life is rapidly increasing. Poverty is, beginning to decline. It's so wonderful. This is real socialism. This is what we need here in the United States. And then, of course, you'll remember almost immediately after their economy began to slide into the shitter, they started putting out these articles where they're like, well, it's not really socialism. Here's some elements of capitalism. Socialism's incompatible with killing people and, just like goofy shit like that. They're doing it, though, this time. Nicaragua hasn't collapsed. The economy of Nicaragua is actually, compared to some of its neighbors, still relatively stable. But they're preemptively deciding to try to label it not actually socialistic anymore before it collapses this time. Because they know, looking at Ortega's actions, they bear an eerie resemblance to what happens in tin horn nations that are only democratic in a technicality. That is, you have these nations where, the leader's elected, but over time they amalgamate enough power, so they're not really anything but a dictator. The only constraint on them is that they keep up the decorum as though it was still a republic. That is, they choose not to extend themselves too much. They choose, generally, given the option, not to shoot dissidents. When given the option, they will try not to override the courts and tear up the Constitution. When given the option, they will generally go along with what the legislative body that may exist in these countries says because it's good for business. Essentially, it helps them keep power because they're like, hey, no one else can condemn them because they're like, hey, yeah, we've got our own problems, but it's a functioning representative government. I was duly elected. I've listened to the legislature. I'm, not trying to screw anyone over. We're just democratic socialists, just like Bernie Sanders. And technically, he is. People like Sanders, the far left, the alt-left, you could call them, eventually, because their policies would bankrupt the United States, would inevitably have to use violence to control dissidents. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in power anymore. Now, thankfully, of course, in a system like ours, where you've got a lot of very well-armed people, that probably wouldn't be as much of a problem. But, of course, one of the first things the left does when in power is try to disarm its own people. There's a reason for that. It can only be a malevolent reason. When we see all these states suing over 3D printed guns, it's for malevolent purposes. They know full well that these guns are not going to be used generally in crime any more than any other guns. They already know that, but they pretend that it's a big problem in order to try to keep people as unarmed as possible whenever possible. Any group of people they can disarm, they will gladly do so. There's a reason for that, and we should question what that reason is. Sane people do. But the Huffington Post is so-called progressive. Now, there's no such thing as a progressive in leftist politics. What you are proposing is not progressive. It's based on basically Karl Marx light. It comes from the 1800s. It comes from a utopian ideology based on a pre-modern scientific view of primitive cultures. That's basically what your ideology boils down to. And it doesn't work. And we can demonstrate it doesn't work because we can't find a single instance of genuine, real, pure, true, whatever you want to call it, socialism being properly implemented without eventually degrading. It always collapses. Whereas capitalism is the norm of all human society for its entire history, always has been, always will be, and when suppressed tends to lead to the creation of black markets. That's just the way that it's going to be. It's inevitable. You've already ideologically lost. People have begun to understand this in most of the world. Unfortunately, people in countries that have never tried socialism on paper in actuality, that is, declaring themselves socialist, unfortunately, their citizens don't realize how bad those programs are. But no, the Sandinistas don't stop being a democratic socialist body. Think about what that means. Socialism. The redistribution and semi-public ownership of the means of production. They have that. That is socialism. That is their economic principle. Democratic. They have an elected system. That is, the socialists are in power because they were elected to their positions. They have that. They have elections. They're sham elections just like in Venezuela, but they do happen. And until now, nobody really gave a fuck because Ortega wasn't at least purging people like Maduro does. So now Venezuela and Nicaragua, which both have been held up kind of by socialists, yeah, it's real socialism. Look, Nicaragua, they're better off than these evil capitalists around them, like in El Salvador or something. There's less poverty, less crime, so that's a good thing. They're real socialists. See, socialism is great. Then, of course, what happens is, yeah, the crime rate is low, but then the government becomes the criminals. Therein lies the problem. With Venezuela, it's the same thing. Maduro, the only reason Maduro's regime looked good, and none of these socialists had the mental capacity to understand this, is because the one thing they export happened to be worth a lot of money. The second that dried up, which it inevitably was going to do by one means or another, they got fucked. They, of course, bought into the peak oil bullshit, too. They thought, oh, it'll probably just keep rising. Venezuela will eventually become more powerful than the United States because it has so much oil. It's like, you're full of shit. You don't understand anything. That's why you're a socialist, honestly. Just like Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All proposal there, and it turns out it'll cost... Now, somebody was criticizing me in DMs and like, well... This institute that did this study is a libertarian outlet, so it can't be trusted. I'm thinking to myself, yeah, no, naturally libertarians are going to generally oppose this, but that doesn't mean that the numerics of it are wrong. I'm sure if Bernie Sanders had a study conducted by some progressive think tank, they would say, no, don't worry, we can totally pay for this. It'll be totally fine. We'll just, we'll get rid of the U.S. military. We'll get rid of the police. We'll basically take up the suggestions of the actual further right. We'll take up the suggestions of Chelsea Manning. And then no problem. We can have free healthcare. We can have free everything. Yeah, fuck it. We're just going to ignore our role in the world. Not only are we not going to world police, we won't even have a fucking police. We won't even police our own citizens. We'll just have Antifa do it for us. There are people they're crazy and moronic enough to actually think that these sorts of proposals are number one feasible, number two constitutional, and number three would work. They would actually uplift people. It's like the problem of progressives generally isn't that they're malevolent. I know some of the people who proclaim them, don't get me wrong, people who proclaim themselves that and then run for office typically are. They know that it won't work and they're being dishonest and trying to embezzle money generally. They're trying to get into power because they like power. They're corrupt. The lay progressives mean well. The problem is the road to hell is paved with good intentions. On paper, it looks really good. Well, police brutality? Well, just disarm the police. We'll be like the UK or something. Military complex? Just ban most of the military. Go back to vigilante justice, I guess. On there's gun crime? We'll ban all guns. People get sick? Oh, we'll just tax the rich more and then we'll pay for everything. We'll subsidize all the food. We'll be in utopia. There's the problem. It is a utopian ideology. It's no different from anarcho-capitalism, by the way. I stress this, within libertarianism, there are two main components. People like myself, monarchists who believe in a much smaller, constitutionally properly constrained, limited, classically liberal government, and then people who believe in the virtual abolition of government in favor of private entities basically governing everything. The latter cannot work. It simply will not function. Eventually, it corrupts itself into mob rule through one mean or another, and it would become a very chaotic, very short-lived society that would get subsumed by outside groups that have greater central organization. But monarchism has been shown to work. It worked for the first century of our history. It's pretty great. It worked until after the Civil War, when states began being treated unequally because of what had happened prior. And then you get the rail barons, the steel and coal barons in, they form monopolies and trusts, and then the government, instead of putting the genie back in the bottle and solving the problem, they embarked on the progressive era, which meant even more government. So you had corruption in private circles, so then the government became corrupt to combat it. But then they just corrupted one another continuously, leading to the problems we have today. And then FDR, who was a socialist, essentially, he brings forth the modern military-industrial complex, which plunges us further into darkness. And then you have the grand chessboard emerge with the atomic era, and now we can't put the genie back in the bottle. It's no longer feasible to do so. We've been partially doomed by the atomic era. Many advances it brought us, and many detriments as well. So what I would say about the Huffington Post is playing newspeak and trying to label them fascists. because of the fact that they've, started to shoot people. No, they're still democratic socialists. They were elected, and they embark upon socialism. They are democratic socialists. You don't magically become a fascist because of violence. The far left is far more violent than the far right at this point. I'm seeing considerably larger amounts of violence aimed at people who are perceived of as fascists than by people who you perceive as fascists. Isn't that something? That's about all. Peace out.